They told her to sign it like it was paper on a desk and nothing else. An administrative detail, a box checked, the formal seal on a life she was supposed to have already abandoned. Lu Yao signed. She folded the pen back into its clip. The signature looked smaller than she imagined. It fit neatly into the space the lawyers expected her to fill. Outside, cameras caught the brief, neutral smiles she forced for the shutter clicks. Inside, her ribs felt hollowed out by an absence that wasn't only the man who had stood across from her for years. That night, under the harsh light of her apartment, she found the sonogram on the passenger seat of Shao Yunchen's car. He had left it there earlier. An envelope, an appointment card, a number she didn't recognize. She could have left it. She could have driven away and burned every scrap that remembered him. Instead, she sat in the car with the engine off, the city noise a distant roar, and unfolded the paper with fingers that trembled for reasons that were not only the chill of the autumn wind. Two tiny shapes dove across the gray of the print. Twins, the doctor had said finally, when she went back to the clinic because she couldn't sleep, because the thought wouldn't stop. Twins. The word landed like a small, complicated miracle, and a question both too big to answer and too real to deny. She read the appointment card again, traced the loops of the inscription where the nurse had written, "First trimester screening, high risk, monitor closely." She was 31. She had signed a divorce that morning. She had two tiny lives growing inside her. The world had not finished rearranging. If you love comeback stories, like and subscribe. They began with whisper-thin things. A headline published at dawn, "Longtang scandal widens, prominent local executive detained." It named her father in the second paragraph and then folded out like a map of debris. Accounts frozen, social media threads, speculation about bonuses and dates, and secret offshore accounts. Her mother's voice on the other end of the phone was a tremor held together by brittle anger. Her younger brother's messages were a parade of anger and shame that asked how she could stand for this family with the world watching. Shao Yunchen's office statement arrived like a measured chord. He offered regret, expressed distance, and added a single lethal clause of convenience. Given the current circumstances, the marriage is untenable. Untenable. The word hung between them in their joint statement as if it were a mutual condition. They both acknowledged a reasonable financial adjustment, a clean break for the board and for the tabloids. But Lu Yao had been paying for other people's choices longer than she cared to count. When he called, his voice, usually low and instructive, was thin and guarded. He asked her to consider the optics. He asked what was best for the family. "What about me?" she asked, because the question had to be asked, even if she already knew he would answer with a ledger. Later, in the glow of an elevator mirror, she signed the papers that formalized the separation. The lawyer slid the folder across the marble. There were lines to initial and boxes to tick: custody, property distribution, confidentiality clauses. She initialed the paragraph that released him from liability. The ink bled slightly where her thumb had pressed too hard. She considered stealing back the packet and crumpling it, but there was a quiet clarity in finishing what had to be done. The fall that followed was not cinematic in the way tabloids promised. It was granular. It was 100 small betrayals that, stacked, made a mountain. Neighbors whispered as she pulled her car into the building. HR sent a gentle email about protecting confidential information. A client canceled a lunch, citing scheduling conflicts. The more she tried to hold her world together, the more the seams showed. On the second week after the papers, there was a night in a dim bar where rumors danced like cigarette smoke, and a journalist with a phone asked her a question while his camera waited like a hawk. He wanted quotes. She had learned a rule early in her career: never give them the soundbite they expect. But this time, words came anyway. Quiet, sharp, honest. "I did not participate in the crimes my father is accused of," she said. "I am not his ledger." They pressed. A glass went across the table. One of Shao Yunchen's distant relatives, a man with the easy arrogance of money that does not have to work for itself, raised a toast to making room for more suitable partners. He had smiled in a way that suggested he was offering advice and threatening at once. Someone else laughed, and the laughter wobbled into cruelty. The glass shattered on the tile with a sound she would remember for months, the high, crystalline snap that makes people look up and then look away. A bartender stepped forward, muttered an apology, and replaced the glass as if replacing the glass could repair the social fracture on the table. She left with a bruise under her jaw where his fingers had brushed her in passing. He would later call it a misunderstanding. She would later call it public humiliation. Work did not stop. The project she managed, an initiative with a $2 million bridge funding deadline, a partnership deal that would determine whether dozens of jobs moved forward, did not wait for her to be less scandalized, less shaken. Her team, a patchwork of loyal associates and cautious hires, looked to her in the morning as if she might not be there by afternoon. She went into the office and found 1,000 ways to make herself small, and a few ways, where it mattered, not to. Winning a client in a game of pool was an odd thing to be proud of, but it became important. The client was the CEO of a mid-sized distributor who believed in symbols. He liked deals closed in unconventional places. She had played once with a colleague to lighten an anxious lunch, and the table had been a microcosm of her life: angles, rebounds, unexpected pockets. She wasn't much of a show-off, but the moment she aimed, the cue felt like a hand that had remembered 100 decisions. The 8 ball slipped into the corner, the room erupted into a smattering of applause, and the client laughed in a way that signified agreement more than pleasure. "You're better at the bank than you let on," he said, sliding the contract across the felt. She signed the initial agreement for a pilot program beneath the bar's low light. It was, professionally, a small victory, but in the context of a life that felt under siege, it was a rope thrown across a chasm. She kept it in her purse beneath a folded receipt. Fu Shuizi noticed those small things, like predators notice someone limping. He was smooth and patient, the kind of rival who built momentum through sugar and then struck with a blade of paperwork. He had his own calculus, placement in the Shao network, ambition polished like a mirror. He smiled at team gatherings and made jokes that folded into insult, then offered to help when she was most exposed. In meetings, he recommended people to the board as though he were distributing favors. He offered subtle suggestions that nudged the company's governance into areas that favored his partners. He brought a vendor to an introduction meeting, then introduced them to Shao Yunchen as if they were old colleagues. He would later be named as the orchestrator of a series of setbacks: contract delays, a sudden audit, then the ugly rumor that the company could lose a strategic client because of the scandal surrounding her family. His moves slid into place like a slow puzzle. Her father was in custody. The legal process moved like a machine, inexorable and impersonal. The investigation's press release mentioned names she had not heard in years. The public called it a fall from grace. She called it a rearrangement of risk. Friends disappeared from group chats. People she had mentored offered sking condolences from a safe distance. She counted the cost not in pity, but in logistics: a mortgage that required reassessment, a lease guarantor who withdrew upon hearing the news, a retainer fee for a specialist who refused to accept payment until the case had cleared up. Money was mechanical. Shame had theatrics. Both were exhausting. Through it all, Chen was a constant. He had been a friend since early in her career, a steady presence who came with an engineer's mind and a doctor's heart. Where others offered advice, he offered presence: a warm thermos of soup in the hospital waiting room, a pragmatic review of the balance sheet, eyes that did not flinch when she told him she was pregnant. He did not ask what she planned to do. He did not present a plan she must follow. He asked what she needed most. "We'll get through the first trimester," he said, the first night he sat with her and the stretch of late-night monitors. One appointment at a time. There was a medical complexity to their deliveries of comfort. Twin pregnancies carried a higher rate of complications: placental insufficiency, premature labor, the heightened vigilance that makes expectant mothers live in a careful half-light. Her doctor, a woman with the efficient kindness of someone who had seen 1,000 anxious faces, wrote lists. No heavy lifting, frequent check-ins, blood work every few weeks. "You're young and healthy," she said, "but this is a high-risk category. We protect what we can." Lu Yao learned to translate medical recommendations into the language of her life. The meetings she would cancel, the nights she would ask Chen to pick up dinner, the assistants she would brief in case a morning left her vomiting and pale and unfit for negotiation. She scheduled reviews. She marked the app on her phone with appointment times and the names of nurses. She bought a maternity coat that folded around her like armor. Mu Cheng arrived the way unlikely allies do in corporate stories: quiet, unanticipated, and precisely when required. His reputation preceded him: a tech genius who could rebuild systems with patience and an almost irritatingly calm efficiency. He owed her nothing. He had never attended a social event at Shao House. He had not signed any condolence letter. He showed up with a recovery drive and a calm that smelled faintly of solder and coffee. "You want the backup," he said, speaking as if the world were a logic problem, not a calamity. He sat across from her at the small conference table like a man who had decided his presence would be strategic. "I can try to recover the logs, but if someone's moving things quietly, we'll need a ledger from the bank." He didn't smile much, but when he found a pattern in the corrupted files, an unauthorized export at 1:12 a.m. on a Friday, the signature of an internal account that had recently been closed, he pinged Chen with a note and then told Lu Yao, "Someone erased the breadcrumbs. We can reconstruct them if we can get the backup server access and a warrant." It was a small victory. It made the problem winnable for the first time. It also painted a target on her back. Whoever had engineered the early morning export had been clever. Whoever had closed the account had been smarter. The effort to trace it meant bureaucracy, police forms, back and forth with a bank whose compliance team treated requests like problems to delay rather than solve. But at least the fight had a shape. A month into the public storm, a letter arrived at the office. No return address, no signature. The envelope was thick, inked in a tidy hand. Inside, a printout of a photograph, a bowl of soup steaming on a table. Someone had circled the rim of the bowl in red. Below the image, a single line: "Some things are better left unclaimed." She showed it to Chen and to Mu Cheng in the quiet of her office after hours. They held the paper like a contagion. The hair at the nape of her neck bristled. "Threats are common in this line of work," Chen said, trying for a tone that was both practical and soothing. "We report it, security reviews, we make it a matter for the police." "Not all threats are idle," Mu Cheng said. "This is specific. Someone knows you're pregnant. This is designed to make you fear for your children." That night, she slept badly. The sonogram photos lay in the bedside drawer like secrets she had chosen to keep. Images on flickering news feeds suggested that the world loved nothing more than a spectacle: scandal, then rumor, then climax in court if the story had legs. She dreamed of a pot on the stove and a hand reaching into it. The attempt came like a flat, gray day in November. The company had arranged a modest lunch when a potential investor flew in from the coast. Meetings were tight, the day dense with presentations. Lu Yao had eaten lightly, soup and a piece of steamed fish that day, because the nausea was an honest companion, and she kept her hands folded on the folder in her lap. The investor asked about milestones. She answered with practiced metric clarity. When the conversation slowed, a manager brought soup bowls to the conference table. The steam rose and made brief, comforting halos above crockery. She took a spoonful because politeness is a currency she had been taught to spend, even when the stomach says no. The liquid was warm and bland and smelled of stock. The first taste was fine. The second began to sting at the back of her throat like one of those sudden allergies you don't expect. Her mouth felt dry. Her fingers tightened around the spoon. "Are you all right?" The investor's voice was a question that had been softened by years of polite dinners. She left the table. She did not want to pass out in the conference room, with clients and rivals and cameras pretending not to be cameras. The white of the corridor was bright and then dim, like the world happening at the top of a slide. Her heart found a rhythm in panic that was not steady. She reached the stairwell and leaned against the cool tiles. The world was framed in a kind of tunnel. From the stairwell came a small, precise voice. "Lu Yao?" Mu Cheng had followed, without anyone announcing. His face was drawn. He had the look of someone who had run, been assessed. He stood beside her and took her hand like a team captain might take a player's. "Hospital," he said, "now." The ER room smelled of antiseptic and fear and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Nurses moved with the practiced economy of people accustomed to crisis. The doctor on duty ran through questions, timing, symptoms, quantity. They put a monitor on her abdomen, one that showed the soft twin peaks of 2 heartbeats like a radio signal. They drew blood, tubes clinking into a rack, and she watched the red drip into plastic and thought absurdly that it looked like ordinary, dependable paint. "I think someone may have tampered with the food," she said, haltingly, because she could tell the sentence, and she had not wanted to speak it aloud until someone else heard it and agreed. They tested. They administered fluids. The doctor, older, with a voice shaped by 1,000 comforting rehearsals, explained possibilities: a foodborne toxin, a contaminant, an allergic reaction. He did not use the word poison. He used words that felt like medication themselves: meticulous, protocol, monitoring. "Might be transient," he said, "but given your pregnancy, we proceed with caution." The hours folded into a narrow infinity. Chen sat in the plastic chair by the hospital bed and did not make space for his exhaustion. He kept his phone turned off, hands folded on his knees. Mu Cheng stood near the window and checked his watch like a man trying to bend time toward a solution. The two of them were steady in ways friends must be when hospitals start to sort you into categories. The blood work returned with anomalies. There were markers in her serum they could not immediately identify. Elevated enzymes, a strange compound that did not belong. The toxicology team had to call in an external specialist because the company's on-site lab lacked the specific assay. The wait felt like a punctuation mark in the universe, a pause you are not allowed to fill. Police came with forms and soft eyes. The detectives asked the same battery of questions and then started cataloging access to the conference room, the vendors who had delivered lunch, the security footage from that morning. Someone had placed a delivery in the building lobby and then left. Someone had scrubbed a number off a sign-in sheet. "Is there anyone who might benefit from you being out of the running?" one of the detectives asked with the clinical politeness of someone who had seen enough of human motives to reduce them to the essential, advantage. Her mind went to the men who had smiled at the bar. It went to Fu Shuiji's careful generosity. It went to the envelope with the circled bowl. It went to the way people sharpened themselves on the backs of others. By dawn, the toxicology report had been preliminarily labeled suspicious. The doctors consulted with the obstetrics team, and the obstetrician, a different woman from the previous clinic but equally precise, explained that while neither of the embryos had shown immediate distress, prenatal care would become more intensive. "We will monitor," she said. "We will keep you for observation. We will do an ultrasound daily until stable." The hospital was an ecosystem of small mercies and procedures. They ran scans with the machine's cold face and watched the twin heartbeats flicker like two tiny lighthouses. The babies held form in that distorted light. They had not lost shape. Their little hearts were fierce and absurd and utterly indifferent to the broader human politics arranging outside the room. In the morning, with the sun fragile and the city already noisy, a question landed in Lu Yao's lap. "Do you want me to make a statement?" Chen asked, as if the smallest gestures now mattered most. She thought of the bar, of the glass, of the envelope. She imagined a courtroom where evidence might cut to the bone of someone's face and show motives. She thought of her father in custody, hands bound by other people's choices. She thought of the men who traded whispers for power. She thought, too, of the contract she had just won in a bar and the $2 million that sat like a promise. "No," she said finally. "Not yet. Let them gather their proof." She was a strategist by habit. It was how she read a line item and saw the human cost behind it. It was how she had navigated the political rapids of the office, the social fatalism of family dinners where no one had the courage to be honest. She would not let the narrative of her life be written solely by the cameras or by a man like Fu Shuiji. The detective nodded and took notes. He explained the process. "We'll do forensics on the bowl if it's available, and we'll pull whatever camera footage we can. We'll trace the delivery manifest. If you think you know someone who could be looking to take advantage of the scandal, tell us now." She examined the faces of the people allowed into the square of her life. Chen with his steady mouth, Mu Cheng with his fingers that moved like levers on a board, Mr. Shang with his suit that suggested old money and older patience. She did not trust the world to move at the pace of justice. The court system could be slow and compromised. The boardrooms, too, could be dangerous. Covert minutes and sly memos moved faster than indictments. "Put it on the table," she told Chen and Mu Cheng later, when the hospital allowed her a private hour with a thermos of weak tea. "If someone is trying to break me, they are also trying to break the project. The two things are linked. We have to protect the funding and the babies." Mu Cheng's eyes narrowed in that way that meant he was thinking along webs of contingency. "We can secure the servers," he said. "We can start a run on our backup logs. We can set up a watch on suspicious transactions relating to the project. But this is larger than a single hack. This is a campaign." "Then we treat it like a campaign," Chen said. That afternoon, she made a choice that had less to do with courage in the grand sense than with a stubborn impulse to keep making agency where agency seemed scarce. She asked her assistant to schedule a meeting with the board's most influential members. She drafted an outline that turned the project's timeline into an argument that could not be easily dismissed. $2 million in bridge funding, a partnership with a manufacturer that would add 5,000 jobs in the region, a pilot that could create demonstrable proof of concept in 8 weeks. She framed the ask not as a plea, but as a pivot. At the boardroom, they were polite and cold. The board member from the legal team asked questions that had the soft cruelty of someone setting traps for a witness. "What reassurances can you offer the board given the risk profile?" he asked. She answered with slide decks and contingency plans. She named milestones and people and timelines. She laid out a staffing plan that redistributed risk and gave investors a clearer line of sight. She was not theatrical. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for trust that could be proven. "And if the press makes this worse?" asked another director, who had the look of someone who measured his social capital in $10,000 increments. "Then we handle it the same way we handle every other variable," she said. Her voice did not shake. transparent updates, a ring-fenced budget, a board-appointed audit. We set a condition. If malicious interference can be demonstrated, we accelerate certain clauses to protect the project's continuity. They listened. They hedged. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. The board approved a conditional release of funds, not the full $2 million up front, but a tranche that would keep operations moving for a time. It was a small victory, but it shifted momentum. People in the company started to measure her competence not by the scandal, but by the deliverables. News circulated slowly, then crested. The press asked again for comment about the hospital incident. The police released a statement calling the event under investigation. Fu Shuji, who had been first to smile when rooms went dark, sent a condolence message that arrived with the artificial warmth of a man who was always deployed to the right moment. He posted a public remark about wishing for her recovery. Someone leaked an internal email that tried to frame him as supportive. It was the kind of move that smelled of a crafted narrative. She did not respond on the record. Instead, she kept closing deals. She wrote strategy documents that read like blueprints. She gave interviews about the project metrics and refused to concede space to the scandal. When the media focused on the domestic mess, her team fed them charts. They fed the market's performance indicators and, where appropriate, withheld the personal. The pressure shaped people differently. Some withdrew and became minor ghosts in her life. Some, like Chen, leaned in. Some, like Fu Shuji, sharpened into an obvious adversary. There were nights when she cried inside a car parked illegally outside a hospital while the baby's heartbeats echoed on a portable monitor like small insistences that carried their own logic. Those nights were private and cold and full of a fierce, quiet determination. At the end of a long week, a second envelope arrived. This one had photographs of a different sort, a printed screenshot of a security feed where, in grainy black and white, a figure moved near the building's loading dock at 12:57 a.m. There was an arrow drawn on the image and a phrase, "We see the people who work in the dark." She carried the photo to the detective and watched him examine it with his patient, procedural face. "We can't be certain it's them," he said finally, "but the timestamp matches a chain of custody error in the conference room that morning. We're opening an internal investigation." Someone wanted to make an example. Someone wanted to use fear not merely to damage her, but to unmoor the project, to cut the funding, to place a void where her role had been. Lu Yao did not have the luxury of being broken. She had prenatal vitamins, a lawyer, a friend who slept in the chair beside her hospital bed when the nights grew long, and a stubbornness that had been forged by years of proving competence in rooms that liked to reduce her to small things. She also had Mu Cheng, whose hands could coax data out of corrupted files, and Chen, who was willing to break his own sleep in service of a quiet kind of courage. They decided to make their next move like a chess player who plays several mistakes ahead. She asked Mu Cheng to reconstruct access logs for the delivery service, to trace the route of the soup, and to begin a parallel audit of the vendor's records. He asked for a weekend of undisturbed access to the company's network and an elevated right to examine server history. The thing about digital records is that they rarely disappear wholly. They smear and lie in strange ways, but they leave marks a patient and genius person could follow. "Names will surface," Mu Cheng said, "not as a promise, but as a clinical projection. People will leave patterns." Patterns were a kind of truth. She believed in them. She also believed in boots on the ground, lawyers who could subpoena records, detectives who could interview delivery drivers, colleagues who could provide habit testimony about who had been near the conference room. She spent her days in a small orbit of procedures and protocols, of small victories, a recovered log, a witness who said they remembered seeing a particular van, an accountant who contradicted a rushed ledger. On a rainy evening, with the city damp and the world quiet, Chen sat at her kitchen table with 2 mugs cooling. He had folded her laundry and arranged it into piles that seemed to have an order only an intimate friend would understand. He held his phone in one hand and said, "There's movement on the bank side. Someone is trying to block our access to a tranche." The project had been a lifeline to a future she had not promised herself. Now it was a fortification. "We have to hold the line," she said. They worked in phases that felt like trenches. There were days of radioactive boredom, forms, meetings, approvals, and days of sudden, terrible adrenaline where everything hummed like a live wire. The things that had been done to her were not hypothetical. The threats were real and required a real response. The first part of that response was to document, to show that the attempt on her, if it was an attempt, was part of a pattern that moved from rumor to targeted action. The second part was to keep her visible as a leader who managed through crisis, not as a woman defined by scandal. When she stood before the board at another emergency session, she felt the weight of all she had nearly lost. But she also felt the hard, clear line of someone who had decided to build across the debris. Her presentation was not a plea for sympathy, it was a strategy for resilience. Projects survive not because they avoid shocks, she said, pointer moving across a slide that detailed a contingency plan, but because they build redundancy. We will ring-fence resources and accelerate deliverables to show value under pressure. We will not let external chaos determine internal priorities. She proposed a new oversight committee that would include an external auditor, and she requested that the board consider a temporary public relations strategy to reframe the conversation. It was the kind of governance move that substituted control for panic. It was also, frankly, the speech of a person who would not resign their life to the script someone else had written. When they voted, the room was divided. But again, the board chose to fund a small tranche and to back the oversight committee. It was not a victory that fixed everything. It was a structure. They celebrated the small wins in quiet ways. Chen bought a cake one afternoon and stuck a candle into its center, and for a brief hour, the hospital monitors and legal threats seemed distant. Mu Cheng sent a message with a single line. "We found an irregularity linked to an account closed 2 weeks ago. Tracing now." It read like a note from someone who recognized that information was the kind of currency that could buy you time. Time did not have to be extravagant to be meaningful. It needed only to be used. But danger has a way of escalating when cornered. The morning after the cake, a driver reported an anonymous package left in the building's lobby. Security opened it. Inside was nothing more than a child's toy, a plastic thing that whistled when blown into. It was harmless, and yet the message was clear. We can get close enough to leave messages. We can make you twitch at every sound. Lu Yao made her decision like a general drawing a line in sand. She would not cower. She would move forward. She would protect the twins. She would operate with the clarity of someone who aimed at the problem, not its shadows. At the end of the week, a small, consequential development arrived. An investor from a tech incubator, a man with international ties and a reputation for moving money where vision and data met, expressed interest in a partnership. He had watched the way she navigated the board and the way the team had held together in crisis. He did not offer rescue so much as an invitation. "We back teams who solve hard problems," he told her in a short meeting that smelled faintly of espresso and patience. "We like people who can hold a line." It was not a proposal so much as a recognition, and recognition is a thing that collects into opportunity. It would require ceding a small piece of governance to the incubator and inviting an external CEO to the table as a strategic partner to the project, someone with resources, with a voice, with the ability to publicly share the story that the company would weather the storm. The man suggested a co-led initiative. She would keep her role as project lead, but governance would be distributed, commitment would be visible, and money would move. He left a business card that was thin and hard and smelled faintly of gray. He asked only for a few days to complete his due diligence. That night, Lu Yao lay in the dark and thought of the future like a ledger she was still learning to balance. The babies moved, a faint, undulating reassurance against the quiet. She did not sleep long. The city's nocturnal voice thinned into a single paranoia, someone watching, someone planning. She considered the envelopes and the photos and the soup and the men who smiled in public and hunted in private. When Mu Cheng sent a text at 2 a.m, short, efficient, she read, "We have initial leads on the delivery manifest. The van that made the delivery has been linked to a shell company, cross-referencing names now." She put the phone down and listened to the tiny mechanical cadence of the monitors in the middle of the night hospital quiet. 2 heartbeats, persistent and insistent, like a drum that demanded the world be different. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, something was building toward a convergence. The threat had been intimate, surgical, and by its signature, it promised a continuity. The men who had watched from the edges wanted her gone. The men who wanted the project's cash flow wanted it uninterrupted. And between those two, she stood, small and made of the kind of stubbornness that moves quietly and dangerously. When morning came, the detective called her room and asked if she would come down to the station to look at a lineup. They had a suspect, someone whose van had been on the manifest. They had a name that aligned with a string of accounts. For the first time, the apparatus of law, slow, stubborn, capable of both mistake and justice, began to move with a clarity that made her pulse quicken in unfamiliar ways. She dressed with deliberate slowness. Chen tied her ponytail into a knot and fixed a scarf around her neck like a talisman. Mu Cheng inspected the printout of server logs one last time and tapped a finger along a line he seemed to read not as text but as music. The infant heartbeats hummed in the background like an engine with relentless small revolutions. At the station, they put files on a table and a grainy photograph of a van. They asked her to take her time. They coordinated the lineup. The room hummed with the low sound of people clearing their throats and arranging themselves for the next step of an ordeal that had started long before she signed anything. She could feel the weight of the eyes watching her, the media, a board that measured risk like arithmetic, the whisper networks that would turn the event into 1,000 speculative versions. She walked to the table and steadied herself on the facts she had collected, an excruciatingly small stack of evidence that already felt larger than the sum of its parts. As they brought the lineup into the light and asked her to step closer, her phone buzzed once, an unknown number. She ignored it. She had learned, in the weeks since the first envelope, that some calls were only knives disguised as voices. A single bright lamp hung above the file, and in its circle she saw a man who looked like every manager who had been willing to skimp on ethics to get ahead. He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Do you recognize anyone?" asked the detective. She breathed and listened to the rhythm inside her chest. The 2 heartbeats on the monitor seemed to beat an answer like a private parliament. "I do," she said. The police recorded her statement. The man in the lineup was detained. Charges were pending, and yet the police only moved when the threads were unspooled and matched with confidence. The world, for the first time in weeks, leaned forward with a sliver of justice riding in its balance. But vindication is seldom tidy. The man detained had a small, anonymous salary and a much larger set of patrons. Someone with means had hands in the arrangement. The police needed more. They needed receipts, witnesses, the names of the people who had placed the delivery and the orders. They needed to link the photographs to the hands that had circled them. She drove back to the hospital with hands that felt both small and enormous. The monitor hummed as she settled into the chair beside the bed. When she let herself relax for a minute, the exhaustion came like a wave that would have flattened someone less determined. She had not yet had the space to mourn what she had lost, because everything required her attention. She still had neighbors who peered. She still had a father whose legal storms sent tides into her days. She still had an ex-husband who watched from the edgeless center of his life, who sometimes protected and sometimes withdrew with equal proficiency. And she had something else, an outline of a future that had been darkened but not erased. There were people who wanted her to vanish, and there were people who saw value in her not vanishing. There was money she could secure if she continued to fight with the clarity of someone who knew how to make the numbers tell the truth about the value of a thing. She had decided to rewrite what the divorce had meant. It had not been an endpoint. It was a severance that demanded a new beginning. On the curb outside the hospital, the world looked ordinary. Cabs, late-night coffee stands, fluorescent signage. But it had been rearranged by the events of the last month. The envelopes, the soup, the van, the boardroom votes. These were pieces of a larger engine that would either devour her or become the mechanics by which she would build. When her phone buzzed again, she let it ring. Then she answered. A voice said simply, "We can help with the investor. We have resources, and we want to look at co-governance if you will accept an external partner to stabilize the board." She knew the shape of the offer before the speaker finished. The incubator had accelerated interest. She could accept the governance offer and bring a CEO-level partner into the fold. She could secure funding and visibility. It would mean ceding some control, but it would also mean structural security. It would mean an ally who carried the title and the muscle of a public figure to stand beside. She let the voice on the phone finish, then breathed as if the word partner had given her a little oxygen back. The incubator's offer was everything practical and almost clinical. Funding committed if governance was widened, a public figure to stabilize perception, a board seat for a neutral third party, and a timeline that would show deliverables while investigations progressed. It would change the optics overnight. It would put muscle behind the project's perimeter defenses. It also meant bringing someone new to the table, someone whose title alone could blunt gossip. She asked a question that sounded small but carried everything she'd learned in the last months. Who would be that partner? There was a pause, a sound like a man counting reputations. "We want someone with hands-on credibility," he said. "A CEO who understands technical deliveries and has the appetite to build in a storm. We have someone in mind, someone who impressed us in the lab, who can run the technical side and withstand public pressure." Something about the way he said impressed us made Lu Yao think of Mu Cheng, the man who had arrived with a recovery drive and the exact kind of patience that fit like a glove around messes. She pictured him, fingers stained faintly with solder, eyes that measured things in terms of dependencies and contingencies. He had annoyed her with his quietness and then saved her with his single-minded expertise. He had asked nothing and given everything valuable. "Bring him in," she said. The incubator arranged a meeting within days. Their office was gray and efficient, glass walls, a long table, and enough coffee to make sleep a polite memory. Mu Cheng arrived in a sweater that was plain and somehow more practical than fashionable. He carried two things in a slim bag, a laptop and a calm that read like a promise. The investor watched them together and smiled in a way that sensed possible leverage. "He's a founder," the investor said to Lu Yao afterward, leaning forward. "He can be CEO for a new joint venture we'll launch if you agree to co-governance. He brings the tech muscle. You bring the project and the management muscle. Publicly, we brand it as a co-led initiative. It stabilizes the narrative." Mu Cheng listened. When he spoke, it was with the precision of someone who had spent years composing code and debugging people's assumptions. If this is about stabilizing perception, we have to make the project unassailable, he said. That means transparent metrics, automated reporting, and a ring-fenced infrastructure. We make facts louder than stories. Lu Yao felt something loosen inside her chest. Relief, perhaps, but also the beginning of a new, strange question. Could an alliance be more than guardrails? Could trust built around evidence and competence become something that mattered in a quieter sense? She had no illusion about romance suddenly being simple. There had been too much broken glass for that. But when two people kept showing up for the same fight, intimacy was a side effect. Negotiations were careful and long. She insisted on terms that would protect her autonomy and the twins' future. A board seat of equal weight, decision-making parity on the project's allocation, a clause that made any transfer of governance conditional on performance metrics, and a private trust to ensure prenatal care and financial security if she had to step away for health reasons. He, Mu Cheng, wanted an operational runway long enough to implement security measures without daily political interference. The investor wanted public optics and deliverables. They wrote the agreement in clauses and then in plain language. It was a professional thing at first, a distribution of shares and responsibilities, clauses signed by lawyers in rooms where men and women who smelled only faintly of coffee and determination read paragraphs and nodded. But the legal scaffolding could not account for the small moments between meetings. The quiet after a tense board discussion when Mu Cheng would sit with a cup of tea and ask what she needed for the kids' room. The way he held the folder with her project documents as if they were fragile things he had pledged to guard. The first public announcement was a protective choreography. A press release framed the new joint venture as a strategic incubator spinout that would accelerate the pilot and secure jobs at the manufacturer's plant. The incubator named Mu Cheng as CEO and Lu Yao as co-lead and principal stakeholder for the initiative. Photos showed stern faces and hands on documents. Reporters' questions skirted around her pregnancy with the clumsy politeness of people who wanted a headline without the inconvenience of empathy. The investor quoted metrics. The incubator's PR team emphasized continuity. The public saw two professionals standing beside each other, not a romance being declared under glass. That first week after the announcement, as cameras softened their angles, someone left a note on the company door. It was a photograph of a nursery printed in black and white with the cockeyed handwriting that had marked earlier threats. The photograph was anonymous, the message explicit, the same voice that had sent the bowl of soup shot. It was chilling not because it threatened specifics, but because it assumed her ongoing fear like an entitlement. They stepped up security. The manufacturer put biometric locks on the factory office. The board arranged for a small security detail to accompany her to appointments. Chen started sleeping in shifts at her apartment. He made lists of contacts, called his old network, and rebuilt a safety web out of favors he had long ago shelved. Mu Cheng installed an encrypted line and spent nights poring through server logs with the kind of focus that becomes ritual when danger feels far too close to home. They pressed the investigation outward. Evidence that had been smeared across bureaucracy began to congeal into direction. Delivery manifests traced back through shell companies to a paymaster who had, in turn, been in contact with a disgraced account coordinator at a procurement firm. Payment trails dripped into Fu Shuiji's shadowed circuits. Mu Cheng uncovered a pattern of micro-disbursements that bore the signature of someone covering tracks. Round sums, timed to certain board meetings, tagged against invoices that never quite reconciled. "He's sloppy," Mu Cheng said one night over a whiteboard that had become a map. Not sloppy in the way of careless, sloppy in the way of someone trying to look clever. People who are clever leave patterns, and clever means pride. They sometimes expect their own cleverness to become their invisibility. The police moved. The man detained from the lineup confessed under pressure, and then sang a name that had been floating like a ghost in their ears: Fu Shuiji. They produced a phone record that linked him to the procurement firm and a set of bank transfers that, when matched against redacted invoices, spelled out motive. He wanted influence. He wanted the access a whispered favor at Shao House could buy. He had sharpened other people's fear into his ladder. For him, destabilizing Lu Yao was calculus, the clearing of space for his own ascent. When the detectives took Fu in, his face was not one of surprise, but of smoothed rage. In court, he wore the sort of composed disdain that makes juries distrustful. The prosecution painted him as a man who used networks like a cache of knives, deploying logistics to manipulate outcomes. The defense called him a scapegoat. The press hungrily separated each argument into soundbites. The trial did not happen overnight. The legal system moves in gears both slow and sudden. But the assemblage of logs, the vendor testimony, the recorded conversations that a disgruntled assistant provided as a bargaining chip with the prosecutors, all lined up. Fu's patrons, names that had floated in rumor, proved harder to produce into evidence. But the money trail tied him to a cluster of corporate favors and to a calculus of envy that made him both villain and instrument. The judge handed down a sentence that reflected the gravity of using a vulnerable woman as a pawn: years of restricted movement, fines, and a public reprimand that dismembered his credibility. Socially, his name would be forever tainted. Legally, he had limits. Public opinion shifted like weather. People who had been content to gossip now had a frame to organize outrage. The headlines that once savored scandal now sipped at accountability. The boardroom dynamics resettled. But Lu Yao knew that exposure did not mean the world would stop pushing. The twins were still fragile. The wounds of public humiliation still sat like stones in her pockets. There were still men who would look for an opportunity. And then came the bomb scare. It happened on a mild spring day when the joint venture was hosting a demo for potential suppliers and an investor delegation. The incubator's conference room was bright. Tech folk and manufacturing reps spread across chairs. Mu Cheng was mid-presentation about back-end redundancies when the building's security feed registered an anomaly, an unaccompanied package in the service elevator. The security guard pressed a button, the elevators ground to a halt. Mu Cheng kept talking as if his voice could anchor the room's nerves. Lu Yao watched monitors with a mouth that tasted like metal. The package, when opened in the secured room by a bomb squad in suits so stiff they might have been armor, contained wiring and a heat-activated timer. Trivial but terrifying. It had been designed more like a threat than a weapon. It screamed intimidation. A small oxygen canister and a crudely rigged set of wires were the props of someone who wanted to scare, not necessarily to kill. The police labeled it dangerous intimidation. The media had not yet been invited. The demo had been a private showing, but word leaked like oil. Instantly, the narrative that had been attempting to rewrite her as victim started to harden into a mantle she refused. They wanted to see her shaken. They wanted to see her falter. In the middle of the evacuation, two men pushed past security and tried to approach Mu Cheng. One of them lunged for the laptop. Security moved with a practiced efficiency that made Mu Cheng the kind of target who might be physically taken. In the corridor, by a service door that smelled of detergent and old coffee, Mu Cheng found himself briefly at the wrong end of two quick hands. He grabbed the man's wrist, turned, and for a breath they were face to face. Something in Mu Cheng's steady stare dissuaded them. The would-be assailants fled into a taxi before the police could pursue. For a few minutes after, Lu Yao sat on the curb outside the building and felt an old, deep fear, one that belonged to the first week in the bar, to the envelope with a circled bowl. But now fear was illuminated by company and by countermeasures. Her people gathered around her, Chen with a blanket, Mu Cheng with his hand on her shoulder, a security officer murmuring protocols. They had been almost hostage to their own success. They had escaped with the wounds of shivers and adrenaline. The bomb scare tightened resolve. The investor at the incubator, who had watched the event with a face that hid sympathy behind responsibility, signed the paperwork that made the joint venture official the next week. The new entity had a board that included legal heavyweights, a compliance officer, and a small but highly public security team. Mu Cheng took the CEO title in public. Lu Yao accepted formal co-governance and a very specific role as the project's lead and public figure. They agreed to a visible covenant. All major public appearances would be co-signed, all critical infrastructure would be under Mu Cheng's purview and audited quarterly, and a trust would hold emergency funds for her medical needs and the twins' future. But the formalities were only part of it. Something personal had shifted between them in those compressed months of proximity. Mu Cheng was not demonstrative in the way novels celebrate. He did not write poems or send flowers. He showed concern by ordering a specific model of prenatal pillow that the doctor had recommended, by spending an entire afternoon in a pediatric hospital cafeteria learning the names of nurses who would likely care for her, and by staying with her through ultrasounds when she wanted someone non-judgmental to hold her hand. His attention was ritualized competence. It was, in its own way, affection. Lu Yao learned to be seen differently. She had chosen a life of performance, signatures on contracts, contingency planning, pragmatic speeches. And now she was choosing someone who read her capacity as partnership rather than territory. There were private dinners caught between board meetings where they spoke of things not strictly professional, a childhood memory, a mundane embarrassment, a dish they both liked. They would sometimes walk home together, their steps measured by city rhythm, and the conversation would drift from supply chain metrics to the silly fears people carried, like being laughed at in a staff meeting. In the quiet of the cab, Mu Cheng would look at her with a soft concentration that acknowledged the truth of her days. The legal aftermath of Fu's arrest continued with hearings that exposed a pattern of entitlement in corners of the industry's procurement chain. Testimony named names, and the press fed on the spectacle of people being publicly unmasked. Ada, the PR person Lu Yao had hired to manage crisis narratives, wrote a statement that was part legal, part moral, and entirely strategic. This has been a campaign against one woman and a project created to build jobs and value. We have chosen to respond with transparency, with due process, and with decisive action. Our work continues. When the court handed Fu a sentence that included imprisonment and restitution, there was a muted satisfaction, a correction in the public ledger. He was not the only figure removed. The investigation forced others to resign quietly, to find smaller reputations to hide behind. There were apologies and then silence. Those who had maneuvered most cruelly faded as accountability and time did their blunt work. The project moved forward. The bridge funding was released under the new governance, and Mu Cheng and Lu Yao began to operate as a unit that expected friction and planned for it. They implemented automated dashboards that reported real-time progress to stakeholders. They set up independent audits, and they announced accelerated pilots to demonstrate impact within weeks. The manufacturer began the first runs. Workers were called back. The numbers started to look like something that promised wages and futures. In the midst of operations, Lu Yao still had medical appointments. The twins, 2 rhythmic heartbeats in the dark, were watched and monitored. There were scares, a premature tightening that had them in the hospital for 48 hours, a protocol that included bed rest and observation. The doctor, who told her gently that twin pregnancies often required patience and that their priority was to deliver 2 healthy infants when ready. She learned the vocabulary of risk and the vocabulary of hope simultaneously. Chen reorganized his life around hospital runs and court dates. He insisted on small joys, a painting for the nursery, a raspberry jam that she liked at 3 in the morning when insomnia pressed. The team's public work changed her private rhythms. She found satisfaction in the competence that translated straight from daily tasks to survival. She was no longer only defending herself. She was building, tightening, expanding. She began to mentor younger managers on risk allocation, not as a gesture, but because she understood how fragile careers could be when the world's gossip seized upon a private loss. Her speeches at company events were not the acquiescent apologies of someone embarrassed by attention. They were clarion calls for resilience. "We will measure our success by service, not scandal," she told a room of factory workers and investors.
"We will show durability in our deliverables." Public affection turned slowly toward respect. A business magazine featured them as a case study in crisis leadership, how a team rebuilt under fire. The article highlighted the joint venture's approach to governance, the audited pipeline, and the unusual pairing of tech pragmatism with operational leadership. It noted Mu Chang's steady hand and Lu Yao's unflinching drive. The headline was less salacious now and more boringly powerful, exactly what she wanted. Romance, threaded through work and danger, did not arrive as a fanfare. It arrived as steady kindness and as small, private moments of clarity. One evening, after a long series of investor calls, they sat in the cramped living room of her apartment while the news played softly in the background. She had the ultrasound photo in a frame on the mantel, and a lamp cast light across the papers littered on the coffee table: contracts, invoices, hospital appointment cards. "Do you want this life?" he asked quietly, not pressing but asking as if the answer could shift the planet. She considered the question like an accountant considering a ledger with sentimental value. "I want a life where I can be both present and powerful," she said. "I want my children to see their mother as someone who did not let fear decide their fate. I want partnership with someone who will negotiate with me, not for me." He looked at her then with an expression that made her feel known. "I want that too," he said. "I want to be present and useful. I don't want titles to be shields. I want them to be commitments." They did not speak of marriage in that conversation. They spoke of partnership in terms that honored their autonomy and their shared goals. They agreed to define their relationship publicly as partners at work and colleagues in life, and privately as people who had chosen to stand together. Later, in a small moment that surprised both of them, Mu Chang kissed the side of her forehead, an act not bureaucratic but tender, and she felt something among the bristles of old fear unclench. The pregnancy continued under close medical supervision. The doctors warned about prematurity and other twin-associated complications. They recommended pacing and early planning for a likely NICU stay if necessary. She prepared with the methodical grace of someone who had learned to plan everything: a bag with essentials, a pediatrician chosen after careful interviews, a hospital with a good neonatal unit on the short list. The joint venture set up an emergency fund for any medical needs. It was both humane and practical. Friends, some old, some new, left small gifts at her door. The world around her felt quieter and more controlled than it had months earlier. There were ceremonial moments too. The joint venture signed its first major contract in a small ceremony that the incubator filmed for stakeholders. Lu Yao and Mu Cheng sat side by side as their hands rested on the same document. Cameras flashed, colleagues applauded. It was the kind of public ritual that rewrites the narrative. One of 2 leaders, both competent and equal, signing their names to the future.
She felt a small, sharp pride. She had turned a divorce, something meant to be final, into a lever. The days between now and the eventual delivery had rhythms of their own. Board meetings on Tuesdays, compliance reports on Thursdays, ultrasound appointments on alternate mornings. Chen remained the friend who showed up with socks and jokes and the ability to order the exact Chinese soup that soothed her stomach. Aunt Shao, who had once been a sharp thorn at roadblocks, adjusted herself into a distant observer who phoned sometimes with awkward condolences and sometimes with small, perfunctory contributions to the nursery fund. Shao Yunchen moved in the periphery of public life, sympathetic now and then, pragmatic at others. He called sometimes. His voice was a color she no longer held as a central hue. The divorce had severed more than jurisdiction. It had remade expectations. The legal consequences for Fu Zhuaji and his network were not total revenge, but they were practical and final in the ways that mattered. Civil suits, settlements, public retraction of certain slurs. He lost the informal leverage he'd cultivated. His attempts at reconciliation with institutions he'd harmed were turned away. When people who had once whispered his name began to apologize, their apologies sounded like small, desperate attempts at clearing social credit. Lu Yao accepted none publicly. She had no appetite for theatrical forgiveness. Her goal was not humiliation of others, but the restoration of peace. At a midpoint in the pregnancy, when the world seemed to have shifted from crisis to careful maintenance, something happened that tested them both. The project's test pilot encountered a defect in a batch that had nothing to do with sabotage, but everything to do with supply chain complexity. An essential part had degraded unexpectedly. The manufacturer faced delays. Investors demanded answers. Board members' old instincts, risk-averse and quick to flinch, surfaced like old bruises. Lu Yao and Mu Cheng spent a night in a war room analyzing the defect, speaking to engineers, and visiting the production line at dawn. They worked with suppliers and performed root cause analysis. Where others might have blamed human error, they looked for systems' weak points. They redesigned the workflow and shifted the supplier base, an act that required contractual gymnastics and a trust-building conversation with the factory manager who had once eyed them with suspicion. 2 weeks later, the revised batch passed tests. The board sent a terse but honest message. Good leadership is measured in restoration, not simply in the initial victory. They had kept their jobs. The factory workers kept theirs. The project that started as a year-long pilot began to show progress markers that justified further funding. It was proof, in financial terms, that her choice to insist on governance parity had been the right call. She did not diminish the role of luck, but she acknowledged the truth that competence, when consistent and visible, changes people's calculations. As the due date approached, the joint venture's public PR moved from damage control to storytelling, a new narrative about the woman who refused to be reduced, the CEO who had built infrastructure, and a partnership that modeled shared leadership. They were careful not to exploit the pregnancy, but they did not hide it either. There was dignity in the way they announced the temporary sabbatical plan for Lu Yao and the acting leadership arrangement. They communicated with transparency, and for once, leverage felt like a fair word. When labor began, later than the earliest predictions, but sooner than others expected, the hospital admitted Lu Yao in a flurry of efficient calm. There were monitors and a team of doctors who had become familiar faces, and a birthing plan that included contingencies for the likeliness of NICU time. Chen walked with a steady, blank-faced tenderness. Mu Cheng was present at every possible monitoring interval. His hand gripped hers through contractions with a quiet ferocity that made the nurses smile. "Remember to breathe," 2 different doctors said at different moments. It was good advice and also a promise. The delivery was not cinematic in any melodramatic sense. It was hard, mechanical, an orchestration of skill and chance and the slow miracle of small bodies finding the world. She labored for hours. There were moments when fear rose like a crest and then subsided. There were small complications the team managed, sudden drops, and then the recovery of 2 small heartbeats that made the nurses clap in a way that felt more like relief than celebration. They were born, 2 squalling, implacably alive newborns who smelled of hospital soap and possibility. The world compressed into the muffled sound of their cries, into the immediate paperwork and the phone calls that needed to be made. The NICU team moved with a practice that had saved many babies before. They worked while physicians checked charts and updated family in quiet, professional phrases. The first hours in the NICU were a blur of tubes and monitors and the unstoppable, ridiculous awe of being a parent. Lu Yao and Mu Cheng sat side by side in a small waiting room, hands clasped over a single cup of unremarkable hospital tea. There were no grand pronouncements, only a soft, sustained look that meant, "We built this, and we will guard this." When the nurses pushed a wheelchair through the quiet hall to show them the first photos, their faces were small and mottled, but present. A nurse wrapped a tiny blanket around them and then stepped back like someone who had just done a necessary human miracle. Chen stood at the threshold with a small, overwhelmed grin and 2 boxes of pastries from the hospital cafeteria. They named no one yet. The hospital administrative staff filled forms, and Lu Yao initialed with a hand that trembled, not from pain now, but from the weight of the new world. Outside, the newsfeed chimed with messages of congratulations that felt both intimate and absurd. People she had mentored sent emojis. The incubator sent a bouquet and a promise of continued funding. The days that followed were blurred and blessed. The twins remained in the NICU only briefly, long enough to teach Lu Yao and Mu Cheng how tiny shoes could be and how loud love could be in an ordinary life. Both babies, healthy enough, came home with a laundry list of small instructions: monitor temperature, feed on schedule, watch for signs. They came into a tiny sunlit nursery that Chen had painted in a neutral gray and tucked with carefully chosen toys. Life did not become easier in some soft Eden. There were late nights, tantrums pitched by fatigue, the bureaucratic slog of updating daycare registrations, and the untidy logistical reality of a joint venture that demanded both of them. But the shape of their days was different. They were partners in the old, slow ways, splitting night feeds, alternating speaking at conferences, signing papers that meant livelihoods. They were partners in the new ways, too: mutual decision-making about the company's next acquisition, the trust that held the twins' financial future, and tiny rituals of affection: coffee poured for one, a text left on the kitchen counter for the other. Professional milestones followed personal ones. The pilot converted into a longer-term contract. The plant expanded its shift schedule. Women in the local factory, some of whom had once whispered about bankruptcy and scandal, now had longer-term contracts. The press no longer wrote about the envelopes and the soup. They wrote about job creation and sustainable supply chains. The narrative had been transformed, not by one singular act of vindication, but by consistent, honest work that made the project hard to smear. There were residual complications: an ex-colleague who pressed a lawsuit about intellectual property, a small scandal about a vendor who had falsified a small test result. They handled them with the same methodical precision they'd used before: transparency, rapid correction, and a public statement that prioritized restoration of trust. Mu Cheng and Lu Yao's relationship grew in the quiet ways of 2 people who had built things together. They did not romanticize trauma. They did not pretend it had not been brutal. They told each other truths that were sometimes unpleasant. In one conversation, Mu Cheng admitted to regretting not having the courage to shout at a board member he knew had been unfair. In another, Lu Yao confessed an old fear about being abandoned when life got difficult. They responded with what mattered: listening, small reparations, and a commitment to be better. Publicly, the image that framed her story changed from scandal victim to co-leader. She gave a speech at the plant's anniversary that would be replayed in small business circles.
A project is a promise, she said, looking past the cameras to the line of workers who had painted her project into reality. A promise means you will be here when practical things go wrong. We are not here to be rescued. We are here to build. When Fu Shuizi's appeals failed and his reputation shrank into a cautionary footnote, Liu Yao received a formal letter from the court clearing specific accusations that had once been hung around her name. The letter was definitive in tone and dull in paper, and it meant something the tabloids might never celebrate: the formal restoration of her name in legal terms. She did not hold a press conference. She discussed it quietly with Mu Cheng and Chen over tea. It was closure of a sort, but not the kind that erased the months of fear. It was, however, the kind that allowed her to erase the sound of the envelopes in her head. Time, which had moved like a rattling train through her life, slowed, then settled into a pattern of responsibilities and small blessings. At the company's annual report, the joint venture reported growth and a set of new contracts. Investors greeted the news with the kind of smiles earned by positive margins. The board, diverse, wary, and now trained in transparency, authorized expansions. They also, in an accomplishment that felt intimate and structural, voted to formalize Mu Cheng's role as CEO and Liu Yao's as co-founder and executive director, with a clear succession plan. It was a governance model they would later present as a case study for startup resilience. One autumn evening, in the quiet of their living room, Liu Yao looked at the two small figures sleeping in adjacent cribs and then at the man who had been the constant rhythm of the last 2 years. He stood holding 2 mugs, looking slightly awkward in a sweater that was beginning to pill at the elbows. He handed her a mug, sat, and for a moment, both let the weight of their day rest on them. "We could have been rescued in other ways," he said, "but this is better." She set her mug down and smiled, not because of sentiment, but because she recognized the truth in the sentence. "We were not rescued," she said. "We negotiated. We earned it. We built protections." He reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was small and human, no grand declarations, only an intimate confirmation. "Then let's keep building," he said. She could look back and draw a straight line from the signature on the divorce papers to the cribs in the nursery and see a truth most people miss. An ending is rarely simple. It is often a hinge. The divorce had been a severance. What followed had been a long, exacting process of reconstruction. She had been bruised and then made strategic. She had been publicly vulnerable and then publicly competent. She had used the opportunities around her, law, allies, technical prowess, and the rare gift of people who kept showing up to convert fragility into structure. In the months that followed, the joint venture's work created tangible impact. They launched a sustainable manufacturing line that employed 1,000 workers. They developed a supply chain audit that prevented several vendor mishaps in distant regions. They published a handbook on crisis governance they distributed free to small enterprises who had neither resources nor PR teams. Liu Yao chaired programs that trained women in management. She spoke at conferences about the double battlefield women often face, the public and the domestic, and how competence and support can bridge both. People saw her in many ways: as a leader who had harnessed grief and fear into a blueprint, as a co-parent who navigated both nights and numbers, and as a partner who insisted on equality both at home and at the negotiating table. The label and headlines, "Divorce was just the beginning," finally read like a thesis rather than an epitaph. It had been the first line in a long story of tenacity. At a celebration, a small party the incubator threw to mark a milestone, reporters asked the tired, standard question that always waits for a romantic pronouncement. "Are you married?" they asked. Or they asked the question that pretended to want to know the anchor of her domestic life. She understood what they were asking.
Were the cranes of power now balanced by the scaffolding of romance? She looked at Mu Cheng across the room, who had a small smile that was both private and shared. He raised his glass to her. She raised hers in return. She did not speak at length. Titles, she had learned, could be both shields and pledges. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the infants slept in their room under a small mobile of airplanes Chen had strung, she and Mu Cheng walked home in the dusk. They passed by the hospital where they'd spent nights and by the factory that hummed with progress. They paused at a crosswalk and shared a quiet laugh over an old joke that came from a year when everything had been dark. He slipped his hand into the pocket of his jacket, not a dramatic claim, only a small tether. "We are partners," he said simply. "Equal partners," she corrected. He nodded. "Equal partners." They signed the papers that legally formed their company, and then, some months later, the documents that formalized their domestic partnership in a way that protected the twins' trust and clarified rights without theatrics. It was an agreement made without fanfare, a practical arrangement that matched the practical love they had built. There were no vows that implied possession, only promises that read like contracts of care, to consult, to protect, to support. The final public image that most remembered was not a ring or a wedding. It was a photograph of Lu Yao in a boardroom, two small faces peeking from a video call window on the screen behind her, and Mu Cheng at her side. They had just signed the joint venture's first multinational supply contract. She looked into the camera with a steady face that belonged to someone who had learned to take the microphone and insist on the facts. The headline above the image read, "She signed her life back." Divorce had been a hinge. Poison and envelopes had been weapons. The court and public exposure had been slow and imperfect remedies. The new CEO partner, a title that at first felt like a tool, had become a companion in work and life, not a rescuer, but a fellow strategist. Together, they had converted a scandal into guardrails, and then into a platform that created jobs, stability, and small daily kindnesses. Their partnership was not a fairy tale rescue. It was the union of two people who preferred building over being saved. On a cool morning, when the city was a blur of commuters and the nursery smelled faintly of lavender, Lu Yao stood at the window and watched her children sleep one minute and the city's distant hum the next. She had a file in her hand, the quarterly report they would present to the board, and a small private gratitude, the size and simplicity of breath. The divorce paper she had signed months ago remained in a drawer she rarely opened. It no longer felt like a tombstone, but a starting line. She folded the report and placed it on the table. "Beginning," she said aloud, half to herself, half to the room, and then, because some lines need witnesses, she turned to Mu Cheng, who had just entered, and tilted his head like someone listening to music. "Beginning," he echoed, and together they walked toward the day. If this story touched something in you, if the arc from rupture to careful earned thriving mattered, subscribe for more real raw relationship dramas and leadership comebacks. Share Lu Yao's rise with someone who needs to see that an ending can be the first honest page of a new life.